The wind howled through the dense spruce and fir trees, their snow-laden branches bending under the force of the storm. Snowflakes swirled like frozen whispers against the sturdy log walls of the cabin, nestled deep within the wilderness. Inside, the dim glow of a cast-iron wood stove flickered across the wooden interior, casting shifting shadows that danced along the walls. Elliot Ron sat in an old leather chair, his eyes fixed on the crackling fire. Beside him, a tattered Nikon D850 camera rested on the table, a lifeline to the world he had left behind. 2 years had passed since he had retreated to this remote part of Montana, near Glacier National Park, seeking solace in the untamed beauty of the wild. The walls of his cabin were adorned with his photographs: elk grazing in the misty dawn, a bald eagle soaring over a glassy lake, snow-capped ridges glowing under the feeble winter sun. Yet despite the beauty that surrounded him, an oppressive silence filled the cabin, one that pressed against his chest, reminding him of all he had lost. Then a sharp crack shattered the quiet, ice shifting outside. Elliot sat up straight, his pulse quickening. He turned toward the frost-covered window, but the shifting shadows outside made it difficult to discern what had caused the sound. He listened, his breath fogging the glass. Then he heard it, a low guttural whimper, deep and resonant, almost like a dog's butt. Not quite. No one should be out here. The nearest road was 5 miles away, and most creatures avoided human dwellings in winter. His hand instinctively reached for the flashlight on the counter. He clicked it on and approached the door cautiously. Taking a deep breath, he cracked the door open. A blast of icy wind rushed in, making him shiver. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling snow, and at first all he saw was white, an endless, frozen expanse. Then a shape emerged from the storm, a massive figure dark against the snow, huddled near the porch. A bear, but not the kind he had seen in summer, lumbering confidently through the forest. This one was gaunt, its fur matted with ice, its ribs faintly visible beneath the thick coat. Frost clung to its whiskers, and its breath rose in ragged clouds in the freezing air. The bear swayed slightly as it stood, favoring one paw that it kept gingerly lifted. Elliot's stomach twisted. A grizzly, Ursus arctos horribilis, a species both revered and feared in these parts. It wasn't normal for a grizzly to be out during hibernation season, unless something had gone terribly wrong, and this one looked desperate. Instinct screamed at him to shut the door. This was a predator, an apex beast that could kill him with a single swipe. But something about its posture, the exhaustion in its amber eyes, made him hesitate. The bear let out a low groan, shifting slightly but making no move toward him. It lifted its injured paw, as if to show him. Elliot swallowed hard. Was this a plea? All right, he muttered, unsure if he was talking to himself or the bear. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from the chair and stepped cautiously onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. The bear watched him with dull, tired eyes but made no effort to retreat. Up close, the animal's condition was even worse than he had thought. Its coat was patchy, its body trembling from cold and exhaustion. The wound on its paw was raw, a deep gash with blackened edges, frostbite creeping in. "You poor thing," Elliot murmured, his voice cracking. He moved slowly, draping the blanket over the bear's shoulders. The animal flinched but didn't resist. The warmth of the thick wool must have felt like a relief against its frozen fur. Now came the impossible choice. Elliot knew what logic dictated. Close the door, let nature take its course. But the sight of the shivering, injured creature stirred something inside him, a long-buried instinct, a memory of something lost. Against every survival instinct, he stepped back toward the door. "Come on," he said softly. To his astonishment, the bear took a slow, shaky step forward, then another. With a heavy sigh, the beast limped into the warmth of the cabin. The moment it crossed the threshold, it collapsed onto the wooden floor with a dull thud, its sides rising and falling in labored breaths. Elliot stood frozen, gripping the table for support. There was a grizzly in his cabin, a predator just feet away from him, and yet he felt no fear, only an overwhelming wave of pity. His body moved on autopilot. He fetched the first aid kit from a cabinet, along with a jar of honey, real Montana clover honey he had picked up from a roadside stand months ago. He set the jar near the bear, unsure if it could even eat in its condition. The bear's nose twitched. Then with great effort, it lifted its head and licked at the honey, its tongue curling around the rim of the jar. "That's it," Elliot murmured. "You'll be all right. We'll figure this out." As he sat on the floor beside the bear, exhaustion hit him like a tidal wave. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the crushing kind that came with grief and isolation. It was the kind that came with purpose, the kind that made him feel, if only for a moment, alive again. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the cabin was warm. For the first time in a long while, Elliot didn't feel entirely alone. Morning arrived slowly, a pale gray light creeping through the frost-rimmed windows. The storm had left behind a fresh layer of snow, smoothing the landscape outside into an untouched, silent expanse. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the wood stove painted the walls with a soft golden glow, but it wasn't enough to chase the chill from Elliot's bones. He had spent the night in the leather chair, dozing lightly, always keeping one ear tuned to the sounds of his unexpected guest. The bear lay sprawled across the wooden floor, its massive form still except for the rhythmic rise and fall of its breath. The wool blanket draped over its shoulders was damp now, soaked from melted snow and the heat of its own body. Its injured paw rested awkwardly, and Elliot could see the slow, steady rhythm of pain in the animal's heavy breathing. It was alive. That fact alone felt like a small victory. Elliot moved cautiously, rising to his feet and stretching out the stiffness in his limbs. The bear stirred, its amber eyes flickering open, still heavy with exhaustion, but more alert than they had been the night before. "Hey there," Elliot said softly, crouching a safe distance away. "Looks like you made it through the night." The bear blinked, its gaze following him as he moved toward the counter. He hesitated, then pulled the first aid kit forward. His fingers trembled slightly as he sorted through its contents. Antiseptic wipes, bandages, a small tube of antibiotic ointment. He had used these on himself plenty of times, but never on a wild animal. "I'm going to help you," he murmured, mostly to calm himself. "Just don't bite me, okay?" The bear didn't move. It watched him with an expression that was impossible to read, somewhere between weary acceptance and wariness. Elliot exhaled slowly and moved closer, reaching out toward the injured paw. The bear flinched, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest, but it didn't pull away. "Easy," Elliot whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I know it hurts. Just hold still." He began cleaning the wound. The antiseptic wipe drew a sharp, pained hiss from the bear, its body tensing. Elliot winced in sympathy but kept working, carefully dabbing away the dirt and frostbite that had started creeping in along the edges. The wound was worse than he had realized, deeper, rawer. The cold had numbed it to some degree, but frostbite had already taken hold. He applied the ointment with steady hands, then wrapped the paw in layers of gauze until it resembled a makeshift boot. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Not perfect, but it'll do for now." The bear lifted its head slightly, its amber eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made Elliot's chest tighten. It wasn't gratitude, not in the way humans expressed it, but there was something there, a flicker of understanding, a fragile trust. Elliot stood and moved toward the kitchen. His body buzzed with adrenaline, exhaustion, and something else he couldn't quite name. He rummaged through the cabinets, searching for something the bear might be able to eat. His fingers brushed over an old can of salmon. The label faded but still legible. He opened it with a manual can opener, the sharp metallic click echoing in the quiet cabin. The bear's nose twitched at the scent. Elliot hesitated before setting the can on the floor a few feet away. He stepped back, giving the animal space. For a long moment, the bear didn't move. Then slowly it dragged itself toward the food, its movements heavy with exhaustion, but deliberate. It ate slowly, with none of the ravenous energy Elliot had expected. As he watched, Elliot leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. Why had the bear come to him? What had driven it to such desperation that it sought shelter in a human's cabin? Outside, the forest was unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of birdsong and rustling branches were absent, as though the world was holding its breath. Elliot's gaze drifted to the frost-covered window, where the snow-blanketed landscape stretched out in pristine isolation. He had chosen this life for its solitude, had sought refuge in the stillness of the wild to escape the chaos of the world and the chaos in his own mind. But now, with this unexpected visitor lying wounded on his floor, something inside him felt different. Like a door that had been closed for a long time had cracked open, just a little. After finishing the salmon, the bear rested its head on the floor, its breathing slow and steady. Elliot crouched, carefully retrieving the empty can and placing it in the sink. He couldn't help but smile faintly at the sight of the massive creature sprawled out like an overgrown dog. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he murmured. The bear didn't respond, but Elliot wasn't expecting it to. Still, for the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel so empty. The day passed in quiet moments. Elliot busied himself with small tasks, adding logs to the fire, sweeping the floor, preparing his own meager breakfast of oatmeal and instant coffee. All the while, he kept an eye on the bear, watching as it dozed in the warmth of the cabin. By midday, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting pale beams of light across the snow. Elliot stepped outside to check on the generator, the cold biting at his cheeks. The world beyond the cabin felt different, less empty, less his alone. When he returned, the bear was awake, its head lifted slightly, but its attention wasn't on Elliot. It was on the door. Elliot frowned. The bear's posture was different now, alert, deliberate. Its nose twitched as though catching a scent, its ears shifting forward. "What is it?" Elliot asked, stepping inside. The bear didn't look at him. Instead, it stared at the door, then back at him, then back at the door again. Its nose twitched once more. Elliot's pulse quickened. "You trying to tell me something?" The bear huffed softly. Not a growl, not a sign of distress, but something else. Elliot rubbed his temples, glancing at the snow-dusted window. The storm had passed, but something about the air outside felt off. Was someone out there? Was something out there? The bear shifted, its massive paws scraping against the wooden floor as it tried to rise. Elliot instinctively moved closer, hands half raised as if to steady the creature. But the bear wasn't paying attention to him anymore. It was focused entirely on the door. The wind had died down. The forest was still, and Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had driven this bear to his doorstep in the first place, it wasn't over yet. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Inside the cabin, Elliot paced near the window, stealing glances at the bear. It was still staring at the door. A deep unease settled in his gut. The bear wasn't just watching, it was waiting. "For what?" Elliot murmured, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent the past few hours trying to decipher the animal's behavior, but no matter how he looked at it, he kept circling back to the same conclusion. The bear wanted him to follow. He didn't know why. He didn't know where. But the urgency in its amber eyes was impossible to ignore. The bear shifted again, its massive body rising with effort. It took one unsteady step toward the door, then another. When it reached the threshold, it paused and looked back at him. "You want me to come with you?" Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper. The bear let out a low rumble, not aggressive, but insistent. It nudged its nose toward the door, then glanced back at him again. The message was clear. Elliot exhaled, his breath misting in the cabin's cool air. "All right," he muttered, grabbing his coat and pulling it on. "But if this gets me killed, I'm blaming you." The bear waited as he secured his boots and grabbed a flashlight. Then, with one last glance around the cabin, Elliot opened the door. Cold air rushed in. The bear stepped out first, its injured paw sinking into the fresh snow. Elliot followed, shivering as the wind gnawed at his exposed skin. The world outside was eerily silent. The storm had passed, but the thick blanket of snow muffled everything. The creak of tree branches, the distant rustling of the wind. Elliot's boots crunched as he followed the bear's lumbering form into the woods. The trail it left behind was deep, each paw print pressed firmly into the white. He hesitated for a moment, looking back at the cabin, then turned and continued on. The bear led him deeper into the forest, past the frozen creek, past the ridgeline that overlooked the valley. Elliot's breath came in short, sharp bursts. His muscles burned from trudging through the deep snow, but he kept going, driven by a gnawing curiosity and a strange, unshakable sense of trust. Then the bear stopped. They had reached a ravine, its edges softened by heavy drifts of snow. Below, a jagged outcrop of rock jutted from the earth, half buried under the ice. Elliot frowned. "What is this?" The bear didn't answer, of course, but it took another step forward, sniffing the air, then turned to look at him. He hesitated before moving closer to the edge of the ravine. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he peered downward. At first he saw nothing, then movement. A small, shivering shape nestled against the rocks. His heart stopped. A cub. It was barely more than a bundle of fur, its tiny body trembling violently. Another one lay beside it, half buried in the snow. Elliot sucked in a sharp breath. The bear, their mother, hadn't been seeking shelter for herself. She had been seeking help for them. "Jesus," Elliot whispered. He dropped to his knees, pulling off his gloves as he reached down. The first cub was cold, too cold, but it let out a weak, pitiful sound when he touched it. The second didn't move. His stomach twisted. "They won't survive out here," he muttered, half to himself, half to the mother bear. "Not like this." The mother let out a low, desperate sound, nuzzling the nearest cub. Elliot made his decision. One by one, he carefully lifted the cubs, cradling them against his chest. The mother bear watched him, tense but trusting, as he held her offspring close. "We need to get them warm," he said, standing with effort. His arms ached from the weight, but he didn't care. "Come on!" He turned and started back toward the cabin. The mother bear followed, her steps slower, her breath heavy with exhaustion. The journey back was grueling. The sun dipped lower, and the temperature plummeted. Elliot's boots felt like lead as he pushed through the deepening snow, the cubs held tightly in his arms. Their tiny breaths warmed his chest, but their trembling hadn't stopped. Finally, the cabin's glow appeared through the trees. Relief surged through him as he stumbled onto the porch, kicking the door open and stepping inside. The warmth hit them instantly. Elliot wasted no time. He laid the cubs on a folded blanket near the wood stove, quickly adding more logs to the fire. The flames crackled to life, filling the cabin with golden heat. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold. Elliot turned, breathless, and met her gaze. "Come on," he said softly. "It's safe." She stepped inside. Her massive form barely fit through the doorway, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. Her eyes never left her cubs as she moved toward them, nudging them gently with her nose. Elliot watched as the cubs stirred, their shivering slowing. The mother bear curled protectively around them, her body shielding them from the lingering cold. For a long time, Elliot just stood there, watching, processing. Then finally he exhaled and sat down on the floor beside them. The fire crackled. The cabin was warm, and for the first time in years, Elliot felt something he had thought he had lost forever. Purpose. The days passed in a rhythm Elliot had never expected. He cared for the cubs, ensuring they were warm and fed. The mother bear, though still recovering, watched him with wary but steady eyes. A silent understanding had formed between them, a bond born not of necessity, but of something deeper. Spring arrived slowly. The ice began to thaw. The forest came back to life, and Elliot knew the time was coming. The bears needed to return to the wild. The morning he led them back to the ravine was the hardest thing he had ever done. The mother bear stood at the tree line, her fur sleek and healthy once more. The cubs, now stronger, bounded through the snow with clumsy enthusiasm. Elliot crouched and met the mother's gaze one last time. "You're going to be okay," he said quietly. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then with a final huff, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cubs following close behind. Elliot stood there, watching until they were gone. The forest was quiet, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. As he made his way back to the cabin, he felt something else, something warm, something like hope.